that Infada took tactics from the Algerian War, which included random shootings of military people, civilians, bombings of civilians. As the war and these particular tactics were used in Palestine, after we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, these tactics had been used there. These particular tactics are very spectacular. They're the perfect media moment. If someone's lucky enough to capture them with a camera, then the carnage, the body parts, the car, truck parts, the photos of that are captured and represented around the world. Poverty, on the other hand, is something that's very slow and progresses over quite a period of time, and is not something that can be represented well in the news. And when people see poverty in the news, it makes them uncomfortable, so we don't tend to see it agendized very often in the news. This particular study analyzes the representation and framing of Johnson's War on Poverty and his rhetorical vision that became known as the Great Society. I'm going to identify the representation and framing of key themes in his 1964 State of the Union address that began his War on Poverty. The second section of the speech talked about reducing the size of federal government. The reduction of the federal government was an essential theme to the War on Poverty, and is an essential theme to the tax cuts, because it was how he was going to free up money to pay for the War on Poverty. The third section of the speech was the longest section of the speech, and it represented Johnson's agenda as an extension of the archetypal rhetorical vision of the American dream. And it's amazing how many different perceptions of the American dream that are out there. There's some core basic elements to it: freedom, the right to own property, the right to have a business. So there's just these 3 or 4 kind of core things, but then there's a lot of other associations to it. So by representing this vision as an extension of the American dream, as a transformative agent to realize the American dream, Johnson and his speechwriters made a very, very wise choice, because they touched into some very, very deep-seated psychological sets in the American public. By doing this, it creates an instant identification with the particular rhetorical theme that's being forwarded. It establishes an organizational foundation for people to interpret and to make sense of the message, and it also associates that theme with a particular set of beliefs, values, and attitudes, which is really important. Borman claimed that individuals in rhetorical transactions create subjective worlds of common expectations and meanings as they are exposed to different fantasy themes, different rhetorical visions. So, by portraying his rhetorical vision of the War on Poverty as an agent of bringing about, helping people realize the American dream, then it created a social reality for people of the connection between these two things and the need for his War on Poverty. He went about justifying the War on Poverty differently than someone would do in a normal argument. In a normal argument, you make a proposition and then you provide supporting evidence. You provide examples, illustrations, expert testimony. But they chose not to take that route in this particular speech, and they used the thematic structure and the framing and representation of themes to actually create the support for the speech itself. Juxtaposition of the framing and the conclusion goes back to Kennedy's rhetorical vision towards equality and race, and then after that, Johnson's vision of the War on Poverty ends the particular speech. Thus, the primary theme of that particular speech, War on Poverty, was the primary theme of the War on Poverty. Johnson at this particular time didn't claim that as his rhetorical vision. which it in effect was evolving to be. May 22nd, 1964, several months later, after the tax cuts had been passed and had empowered his agenda, then he had a speech at the University of Michigan where he formally announced his rhetorical vision as the Great Society. He dropped the theme of the war on poverty, and from there he referred to it as the battle to build the greats in society. Contained the same particular supporting themes, except now it added the theme on protecting the beauty of the country. In its day, Johnson's war on poverty was very, very successful. Probably no president has gotten as much legislation increasing the size and the number of government programs. It had a significant impact in reducing poverty from 19% down to 11.1% by 1970. So there were some very good tangible results. Today it still lives as food stamps, Social Security, Medicare health coverage, which helps millions and millions of Americans. However, today the war on poverty is a forgotten war. If it's remembered, it's often criticized and degraded. In essence, it wound up being a victim of its own representation and phrasing because you could never win a war on poverty. So the choice of that metaphor was, in the long run, not a good choice. It made short victories, but it was not possible to win the war, and that then in the end basically made it seem like a failed process. We have a significant natural disaster, Katrina, the earthquake that just hit in Haiti there. Unless we see a significant number of people for a short while that are being harmed, that have these terrible conditions, then we don't see poverty in the news. I did a survey, CNN.com headlines of the web from 6/26 to 8/23 in 2008. Bombings were represented in the headlines 14 times in that period. The motives for these bombings were only explained twice. No bombing stories address the structural inequality and the living conditions of the poverty in which the population lived as a motivating factor behind the violence. The social reality that we see in America, why many people are so upset at these heinous acts, and again I don't condone them in any way, is that we tend to perceive all people setting off these blasts as evil terrorists, opposed to people who may be freedom fighters, people who may have religious beliefs that are leading them to struggle for a particular liberation, as the Algerian freedom fighters did in the FLN. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and aloha.
Great job. Thank you.